Picture this. You're standing in the courtyard of a Roman villa in the year 50 AD. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of olive oil, crushed grapes, and the faint metallic temps of iron from the tools hanging nearby. At first glance, the scene feels familiar. White marble columns, carefully trimmed hedges, servants moving silently with amphorae of wine. But at the center of the courtyard, under the dappled sunlight, something far darker is taking place. A wealthy Roman landowner, dressed in a pristine toga with its crimson border carefully arranged, is not admiring his garden. He is not debating philosophy. He is examining a 14-year-old enslaved girl, not as a child, not as a human being, but as livestock. He tilts her chin upward with 2 fingers, prying her mouth open to check her teeth. He circles her like a butcher inspecting an animal at market, noting the curve of her hips, the width of her shoulders, the symmetry of her features. He doesn't ask her name. Names do not matter here. What matters is her breeding potential. He pulls out a bound leather ledger, the kind you might expect to hold grain tallies or vineyard accounts. But instead, he writes down a cold, calculated equation, her estimated breeding value. If she produces 8 healthy children in 20 years, she will yield him roughly 12,000 sesterces. 12,000 for a human life multiplied by more human lives. And here is where your stomach turns. Because this is not a livestock auction. This is not a story about cattle or horses. This is about human beings. Rome, the empire that gave us laws, aqueducts, and literature, also perfected something far more sinister, a systematic program of human breeding. They turned reproduction into arithmetic. They kept detailed records, wrote instruction manuals, and applied agricultural science not to animals but to children, women, and men. Think about that for a moment. When you picture Rome, maybe you imagine marble forums, gladiators clashing in the Colosseum, or philosophers debating in shaded courtyards. But behind that grandeur lay an invisible engine of cruelty. Human breeding was not just an ugly byproduct of slavery. It was a carefully organized machine, one that made Rome rich, powerful, and terrifyingly efficient. And the most chilling part, they documented every detail. One of the most notorious examples comes from the villa records of Marcus Cassius, a man celebrated in Roman history as a politician and general, but whose true fortune came not only from conquest, but from treating human beings like cattle. Archaeologists discovered fragments of his villa records in 1987. What they found reads less like household accounts and more like a nightmare. A healthy 16-year-old woman was valued at 2,000 sesterces, not because of her skills, not because of her humanity, because Cassius calculated she could bear 8 to 10 children in her lifetime. Each child valued at 1,500 sesterces apiece. That meant a single enslaved girl purchased once could yield a profit of 12 to 15,000 over 20 years. A return on investment that any Roman banker would envy, and he did not stop at vague estimates. His ledgers tracked everything: menstrual cycles, pregnancy outcomes, child mortality rates. If a woman failed to conceive within her first year, her value dropped, and she was sold at a discount. If she produced healthy children, her worth rose. One entry even details the purchase of a Greek woman because her previous owner vouched for her exceptional fertility and the quality of her offspring, as if they were discussing a prized racehorse. But here's the part that twists the knife deeper. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaos, it was pairing. Just as dog breeders today select traits to combine speed, strength, appearance, Cassius, and men like him matched men and women for breeding based on desired qualities. Tall, muscular men were paired with women from regions renowned for their craftsmanship and artistry to produce strong yet skilled offspring. Beautiful women were paired with intelligent men, resulting in children who were suited for household service, entertainment, or even tutoring Roman children. The horror here is not just that it happened, but that it happened with such cold, deliberate calculation. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. Rome was not simply using slave labor. It was curating slave bloodlines. It was running breeding experiments across generations, all in the name of profit. Archaeological analysis of Cassius's villa confirms this system. Separate housing existed for women who were pregnant, designed not for their comfort but to maximize child survival. Larger chambers accommodated mothers with multiple young children, minimizing disease spread and keeping valuable breeding stock alive. Inscriptions and graffiti found nearby suggest that mothers were tracked not by names, but by codes numbers and symbols that corresponded to their fertility records. Imagine being stripped of your identity so completely that you became a line item in someone else's farm manual. And if you think this is all exaggerated, forensic science tells the same story. Excavations of Roman slave cemeteries reveal skeletons of women who endured repeated pregnancies starting as young as 13. Their bones show pelvic deformities, evidence of childbirth injuries that today would be considered medical emergencies. Back then, they were simply accepted costs of doing business. If a mother died, the records coldly noted the loss, and her children were transferred to communal care to keep the investment intact. But Cassius was not alone. He was not some twisted outlier. The Romans wrote instruction manuals for this. Think about that for a second. Someone actually sat down with ink and papyrus and decided to write guidelines on how best to breed human beings. Take Marcus Terentius Varro. It's one of Rome's most celebrated agricultural writers, 37 BCE. Published texts meant to teach landowners how to manage farms. Tucked among advice on sheep and cattle breeding were instructions on how to maximize slave reproduction. These writings were preserved in monasteries for centuries, which means generations of readers copied and studied them as if they were normal farming guides. Varro recommended buying young women between 12 and 16 for optimal reproductive potential. Younger girls required more investment before they could begin producing children, but he argued the payoff was worth it. He calculated the ideal age for first pregnancy as 15, maximizing years of childbearing while minimizing maternal deaths that would represent wasted money. Think about that phrasing, maternal death, as wasted money. He even prescribed diets. Pregnant enslaved women were given extra grain and occasional meat, not out of compassion, not because Rome cared about their health, but because stronger babies fetched higher prices. Malnourished mothers produced weaker children, and weaker children meant smaller profits. Every loaf of bread, every ration of meat was an investment in future revenue, and for the men. Varro advised selecting the strongest enslaved males for breeding and housing them apart from others, like prized stallions. These men were rewarded with better food and shelter, but only in exchange for their reproductive services. Their worth was measured by the number and quality of children they fathered. If their offspring were strong and healthy, they were celebrated. If not, they were reassigned to hard labor or discarded entirely. This is not exaggeration. This is history, documented, deliberate, and disturbingly rational. Now ask yourself, when you picture Ramit's temples, its generals, its poets, why don't we picture this? Why don't we see the villas where children were calculated like investments, where teenage girls were turned into breeding machines, where even food and shelter were nothing more than tools for extracting more lives from lives already broken? Truth is, we like to sanitize history. We like to imagine Rome as the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of law and order, the pinnacle of culture. But behind those marble columns and flowing togas was an empire fueled by a breeding industry so systematic, so cold, that it makes you wonder, what does it mean to call a society civilized at all? And this is just the beginning.
Yes.
The deeper we look, the more horrifying it becomes. Imagine for a moment walking into a Roman library around the year 30 BCE. The shelves are lined with scrolls, carefully copied and cataloged by enslaved scribes, who themselves are products of the very system you're about to learn about. A nobleman reaches for one scroll in particular, the agricultural writings of Marcus Terentius Varro. He was Rome's most respected authority on farming, livestock, and estate management, the kind of man whose words were studied like gospel by generations of wealthy landowners. But as the scroll unrolls, you realize this is not just a manual about sheep, cattle, and olive presses. Nestled among instructions for crop rotations and stable management is a section that reads like a blueprint for human trafficking. Varro, in the calm voice of a seasoned farmer, advises his fellow landowners that the optimal age to purchase young women is between 12 and 16 years old. Too young, and they cannot yet produce. Too old, and their years of prime fertility are already slipping away. The ideal, he says, is 15, the sweet spot for maximum reproductive yield. Do you notice the language? Output, efficiency. He speaks about people the way we might talk about wheat or grapes, and this was not shocking to his audience. This was normal. Pregnancy itself was treated as a calculated investment. Varro explained that every additional mouthful of food given to a pregnant enslaved woman was not charity, it was a cost-benefit decision. If you wanted a strong, marketable child, you had to provide grain, a touch of oil, maybe even meat, but not too much. Compassion was irrelevant. This was economics dressed in agricultural prose. Malnourished mothers made weak babies, and weak babies meant smaller profits. So the diet was designed not for her survival or comfort, but to maximize the strength of the product growing inside her womb. And what about the fathers? Varro doesn't call them men, he calls them stallions. It's the word used in the records of villas from across Italy. Selected male slaves were kept apart from the general population, isolated in better housing with improved diets, because their bodies had been designated for one purpose: reproduction. Like prize horses at a stud farm, they were bred for traits: height, strength, stamina, even certain facial features. And just like horses, they were valued not as individuals but as carriers of desirable bloodlines. If a stallion fathered multiple healthy children, he was treasured. His services were scheduled carefully, and his food was better. But if his children were weak, sickly, or did not survive infancy, his value plummeted. He might be reassigned to dangerous labor quarry work, mining, or military construction where death was almost certain. Rome wasted nothing. Even failure had a designated use. Now here is where the cruelty deepens. Once a child was born, the mother's body was not given rest. Varro calculated the timing of pregnancies down to the year. Children were typically separated from their mothers by the age of 5 or 6, not out of concern for their development, but to free the mother for her next pregnancy cycle. In modern terms, imagine a young woman forced to bear a child, then immediately pushed back into pregnancy after weaning, her body breaking down year after year, until she either died from complications or was sold at a discount when her fertility faded. The children themselves were absorbed into training programs like little cogs fed into the machine. Boys might be sent to workshops to learn metalwork or carpentry. Girls were funneled into domestic training, spinning, weaving, or food preparation. Because they were taken so young, their bond to their mothers was deliberately severed. That emotional rupture was not an accident. It was part of the system. And if you think this sounds too systematic to be real, consider this. Varro also recommends what to do with women who fail to conceive. 2 years was the limit. If a woman did not produce children after 2 years of attempts, she was labeled unproductive stock. The advice? Sell her off. Her maintenance costs outweighed her potential. Imagine being reduced to a line in an account book that reads excess cost eliminate. Men too could be cold. If their children were consistently weak, if their bodies broke under strain, or if they simply aged out of prime fertility, they were shifted into the most dangerous, lethal jobs Rome had: stone quarries, underground, mines, or war engineering units where survival was a coin toss. In the coldest terms, they were repurposed until death. Here's a question for you. Doesn't it feel disturbingly modern? Doesn't this sound like the logic of industrial farming applied to people? Rome was not just an ancient empire. It was the prototype for every future system that treated human beings as renewable resources. But the Romans knew something that later systems of slavery would refine even further. Forced reproduction wasn't enough. You had to break the human spirit first. This is where the so-called domestication period comes into play. When a young woman arrived at a villa, maybe she was captured in war, maybe purchased at a market, her first year was not about work. It was about breaking her down. She was isolated, kept in a small room with no contact, except for a designated trainer, usually an older enslaved woman who had already been broken and molded into the system. This wasn't kindness. It was psychological warfare. The new girl was fed just enough to survive. Her body weakened until resistance felt impossible. Food became a weapon, a reward when she obeyed, withheld when she resisted. Over time, she learned that survival itself depended on compliance. Her old name was stripped away, replaced with a Roman name chosen for her by the master. She was forbidden to speak her own language, punished if caught whispering her original words. Her gods, her customs, her songs all erased. And for those who arrived with children, the cruelty was sharper. Their children were taken from them immediately, sold elsewhere, or sent into nurseries, so that the mother's attachment could be broken at the root. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about control. A mother who feared for her child would submit. A woman with no attachments could be remade. And how did they measure success? Rome was disturbingly clear about this too. A fully conditioned breeding woman, according to surviving descriptions, displayed 3 markers: total sexual compliance, detachment from her offspring, and willingness to train new arrivals. Once those boxes were ticked, she was officially considered domesticated stock. Now stop for a second. Think about what that means. It's an empire that wrote poems about love and loyalty, that built temples to virtue and justice, also created an entire vocabulary for breaking children, mothers, and fathers until they were useful only as tools of reproduction. Doesn't that shake the image of Rome you were taught? Doesn't it make you wonder what else we've sanitized about the so-called great civilizations? And here's the most disturbing part. Rome didn't just aim to control one generation. They aimed to erase freedom from memory itself. This is where the concept of the Verni comes in. These were slaves born into slavery, raised from birth inside the villa system. They never knew freedom. To Roman writers, they were the most valuable slaves of all, because unlike captured adults, they had no dangerous memories of liberty. It made no sense that life could be different. They were born into chains, and so chains felt natural. Roman estate manuals actually advised that a well-run villa should be composed mostly of verni, ideally 80% or more. That way, loyalty was baked in from birth. These children were branded or tattooed within days, marked with symbols indicating their parentage, birth year, and intended future role. They were sorted before they could even speak. Those who showed signs of disability, eliminated. Infants who seemed weak were killed, often quietly, sometimes buried in mass graves later discovered by archaeologists. The Roman system had no room for inefficiency, and for those who survived, childhood was engineered to prevent bonds that might challenge the system. Babies were weaned early, handed to group nurseries, and raised by older enslaved women trained in compliance techniques. Family identity was erased. The only family they were allowed to know was the villa itself. As they grew, their education was tailored. If a boy showed skill in carpentry, he was told his talent was a gift from his master, not from himself. If a girl was beautiful, she was trained for domestic service or breeding, never allowed to see her appearance as her own. The most intelligent? Children, yes. Rome identified them early, were trained for administrative roles. Some even received advanced education in literacy and mathematics. But always under the reminder, your mind exists for your master, not for you. And here is where the horror turns even colder. Sexual conditioning began in childhood. Male and female verni alike were taught that their purpose was reproductive. Intimacy was not theirs to control. It was an obligation. From a young age, they were prepared for lives as breeders, caretakers, or trainers without ever imagining they could say no. This is where I pause and ask you, do you see how deliberate this was? This wasn't chaos. This wasn't random cruelty. It was an industrial system designed to crush identity, eliminate resistance, and turn human beings into renewable capital. And this is still only one layer of the story, because Rome didn't just keep this behind villa walls. They put it on display. Now picture the next stage of this system. You leave the villa and follow the crowd toward a bustling Roman market square. First, it looks like any marketplace. Vendors shouting, prices, children weaving between stalls, the smell of fresh bread, olives, and fish thick in the air. But at the center of it all stands a wooden platform. This is no ordinary market. This is where human lives are sold, displayed like produce or livestock. The Romans perfected the spectacle of the slave auction. Ownership, it was about performance. Every potential buyer wanted to see the merchandise, test it, inspect it, the most valuable merchandise. The breeding stock was put under the harshest scrutiny. A young woman, no older than 16, is pushed onto the platform. She stands barefoot, her body trembling not only from fear, but from the knowledge of what comes next. The auctioneer, holding a wooden staff, begins to shout her qualities to the crowd: her age, her health, her fertility history if she has one. Buyers surge closer, but they don't stop at hearing numbers. They demand proof. Teeth are checked for signs of disease. Breasts are squeezed to gauge development. Invasive examinations are carried out right there in the open, under the gaze of strangers. Even her menstrual history is called out, how often she bleeds, whether her cycles are regular, whether she has already borne children. Every intimate detail is reduced to statistics, and the crowd watches. It's not silently, but eagerly, as if this humiliation were entertainment. Because in Rome, it was. Buyers who wanted proven fertility paid extra. A woman who had already produced healthy children was called tested stock. Auctioneers highlighted it the way we might see a guarantee on a modern product. And for girls who had not yet borne children, their virginity was tested and publicly verified. The cruelty wasn't just in the act itself, but in the way it was. Staged deliberately, visibly, to satisfy the doubts of buyers. Men, too, faced this ritual. Breeding males were paraded, their muscles flexed, their strength tested. Auctioneers boasted about how many children a man had fathered, listing the qualities of those children like a product review. Strong, tall, intelligent, obedient. One record describes a man advertised alongside his offspring, his children lined up to show buyers exactly what kind of results they could expect if they purchased him. Think about that. A father forced to stand while strangers examined his sons and daughters, not as people, but as proof of his reproductive worth. And yes, children themselves were sold, often alongside their parents. But not to keep families together, quite the opposite. The spectacle of separating children from mothers was not a tragic accident. It was a deliberate feature of the system. Family bonds created resistance. Separation destroyed hope. A child might be displayed to show the value of its parents' bloodline, then sold to a completely different buyer, tearing apart whatever fragile ties remained. If you've ever wondered why, Rome endured for centuries while so many empires crumbled quickly, part of the answer lies here. They weren't just conquering land, they were farming people. And the auctions were the public face of this hidden engine. But auctions weren't the end of it. Once sold, the bodies of enslaved men and women became subjects of Roman medical science. And this is where the story takes an even darker turn. Roman medicine was advanced for its time. Physicians studied anatomy, wrote treatises, performed surgeries centuries ahead of their peers in other regions. But what happens when scientific skill is applied with no morality? You get a system where human reproduction is studied not to heal but to exploit. Take Cyrannus of Ephesus, one of Rome's most famous physicians. He wrote extensively on gynecology, and while some of his texts were intended to help free women, others focused specifically on enslaved women because their reproductive capacity was seen as an economic resource. Fertility testing procedures, for instance, were invasive and brutal. Women were forced to undergo internal examinations to determine if their wombs were suitable. Their menstrual cycles were monitored obsessively, recorded in villa ledgers. Like cattle breeding logs, pregnant women were fed special diets, not out of compassion but for profit. Records describe calculated rations of barley, beans, and wine designed to produce strong, marketable children. And if complications arose, the mother was expendable, the child was not. Roman physicians developed early forms of cesarean sections, not to save women, but to extract babies from dying mothers. The procedure was fatal almost every time for the mother, but if the child lived, the investment was preserved. Think about that cold arithmetic. The woman's life was worth nothing. The baby's life was a line of profit, and Rome institutionalized this thinking. Medical texts preserved from the era read like veterinary manuals describing enslaved women as breeding stock to be managed, manipulated, and, if necessary, sacrificed. Now ask yourself, how can a society that produced Cicero, Seneca, and Virgil voices of philosophy, poetry, and just as also produce scrolls that detail how to starve a young woman into compliance, how to cut open a dying mother for profit, how to treat fathers and children as walking advertisements? How do we hold those images side by side? The truth is, Rome compartmentalized. Its elites could attend the theater, debate the finer points of Stoic philosophy, and then walk into a courtyard where enslaved girls were examined like animals. To them, there was no contradiction. Civilization and barbarity were two sides of the same Roman coin. And here's where the system reveals its true genius and its true horror. The Romans didn't just rely on brute force to keep this machine running, they relied on normalization. By making auctions public spectacles, by recording pregnancies in ledgers, by writing medical manuals, they made it all seem ordinary. The breeding of human beings was not whispered about in shame. It was written about, calculated, and even celebrated as good management. And yet, even in the midst of this crushing system, resistance simmered. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters shows hidden charms, amulets, and inscriptions scratched into wall symbols of gods and ancestors the enslaved clung to in secret, tiny rebellions of memory. Mothers smuggling lullabies in forbidden languages, fathers teaching sons names that the Romans had erased. Even as Rome tried to erase identity, it seeped through cracks in the walls. But Rome understood the danger of rebellion. And so, alongside the medical texts and the agricultural manuals, there were also manuals of control written and unwritten rules about how to keep enslaved populations docile. Rotate families, separate children, punish any sign of solidarity, reward betrayal. Break one generation, so the next never even dreams of freedom. This is why the Verni, the houseborn, slaves were considered the most valuable. They had no memory of liberty, no whispered stories of life before captivity. To them, slavery was not a condition, it was the world itself. They were the perfect product of Rome's breeding machine. And if all of this feels overwhelming, that's because it was. The scale of it defies comprehension. But pause here, because the story doesn't end in silence. At the edges of this system, something stirred. Not in the villas, not in the auction houses, but on the battlefields of Italy, where a gladiator named Spartacus began to see the weak points in Rome's machine. He understood something the Romans themselves feared, that if the breeding system could be broken, if the records destroyed, if the cycle of generational slavery was disrupted, Rome's foundation would begin to crack, and that realization would lead to one of the most dangerous revolts in the empire's history. Imagine the scene. Southern Italy, 73 BC. A group of gladiators men trained to kill for the entertainment of Rome escape their barracks. At first, it looks like nothing more than a brawl gone too far. Armed with kitchen knives and stolen cleavers, 70 men flee into the countryside. Their leader, a Thracian warrior named Spartacus. The Romans laugh. A handful of runaway slaves. It's hardly worth the ink to report. But within weeks, that handful swells into thousands, then tens of thousands. This was no ordinary slave revolt. Spartacus understood something deeper than Rome's generals ever imagined. He knew the empire's true weakness wasn't its armies, but its breeding system. Rome's future depended on the next generation of enslaved laborers' children raised in captivity, born into obedience. Break that cycle, and you weren't just freeing people. You were cutting off Rome's supply line to the future. So when Spartacus's army swept through the countryside, they didn't just raid villas for food and weapons. They targeted the heart of Rome's machine, the breeding facilities. Picture it, a mob of freed men and women storming a villa courtyard, setting fire to the ledgers, smashing the medical tools, pulling down the nursery walls, slaved mothers clutching their children, fathers rushing to destroy the chains that kept them penned in. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. Archaeological excavations of villas sacked during the revolt tell us how deliberate it was. Burned fragments of ledgers, collapsed nursery rooms, medical instruments twisted in fire. Rebels knew exactly what they were destroying. They weren't simply freeing people for today. They were erasing the infrastructure designed to enslave tomorrow, and Rome panicked. The Roman Senate sent commander after commander to crush the revolt, and each one failed. Spartacus's army wasn't a disorganized mob. It was a force of men and women who had endured Rome's cruelty and had nothing left to lose. For 2 years, the rebels marched up and down Italy, defeating legion after legion. Rome's pride was bleeding, but Rome understood something too. This wasn't just about territory. It was about economics. It's about survival. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, eventually took command. And when he pursued Spartacus, he prioritized not just victory, but protection of the breeding facilities. His dispatches, preserved in fragments, mentioned securing the houses of generation, a chilling phrase that reveals just how central the system was to Roman national security. Think about that. To the most powerful men in Rome, slave breeding wasn't just private business. Was as essential to the empire's stability as its legions. In the end, Spartacus's revolt was crushed. The final battle left tens of thousands of rebels dead. 6,000 survivors were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road from Capua to Roma, warning to anyone who dared challenge the system. And here's the detail the Roman writers lingered on. Many of those crucified were women, not because they had fought with swords, but because they had helped destroy breeding facilities. Rome was sending a message: interfere with the cycle of human reproduction, and your punishment will be legendary. But Rome's fear was justified, because the revolt revealed something profound: that the empire's power wasn't invincible. It rested on a fragile system, one that enslaved people understood all too well. Even crushed Spartacus's rebellion planted a seed of terror in the Roman imagination. Centuries later, archaeologists would find evidence of just how extensive those breeding operations were. At sites across Italy, Pompeii, Tusculum, Herculaneum ground-penetrating radar uncovered specialized building complexes unlike any other Roman architecture. These weren't grand atriums or lavish baths. They were nurseries with underfloor, heating maternity wards with tiled birthing rooms, and segregated barracks for stallion males. The design was coldly practical. It's built for one purpose: to farm people. In one villa near Tusculum, the remains of over 100 infants were discovered in a mass burial pit. Forensic analysis showed they had died within weeks or months of birth, their tiny bones bearing no signs of disease. They hadn't lived long enough for disease. Their deaths were part of the expected loss rate of mass human breeding. In other words, the system was prepared to discard hundreds of lives as waste in the pursuit of profit. And the women. Their skeletons tell the rest of the story. Pelvic deformations from repeated pregnancies starting at ages 13 or 14, evidence of malnutrition, even as their bodies bore the strain of constant childbirth. Spines compressed by labor, bones showing trauma from primitive surgical procedures. In the cemeteries of Rome's villas, you can see the cost of empire written directly into the skeletons of women who never had the chance to live as anything more than wombs for sale. And here's the disturbing truth: Rome didn't invent this. Cruelty in a vacuum, they perfected it. They systematized it. They wrote it down, turned it into manuals, and taught it in schools. And in doing so, it created a template for centuries of slavery that followed. When European colonists built plantations in the Americas, they weren't starting from scratch. They inherited the Roman mindset. Enslaved people were renewable. Resources. Colonial documents from the 16th and 17th centuries explicitly reference Roman agricultural texts. The logic was identical. Feed just enough to produce strong children, separate families to break resistance, reward men. Who fathered the most profitable offspring? Sound familiar? It should, because the echoes are chilling. The plantation systems of the Caribbean and the American South, where enslaved women were forced to bear children who would also be enslaved, were direct descendants of Roman villas. Even the cold language persisted. Enslaved men were called bucks, enslaved women were breeders, and the children? Investments. Even in our world today, the ghosts of Rome's system linger. Modern human trafficking, especially sex trafficking, still relies on the same psychological tools the Romans pioneered: isolation, destruction of identity, starvation as punishment, dependency as reward. It's the same playbook. It's updated for a new millennium. So when you stand in front of the ruins of a Roman villa, it's admiring the mosaics and marble columns, remember what those walls once held. It's not just luxury, but ledgers filled with human pregnancies. Not just fountains, but nurseries where children were branded before they could walk. Not just storerooms for wine and grain, but storerooms for human futures calculated in cold profit margins. And here's the final irony. Rome prided itself on law, on civilization, on philosophy. They told themselves and the world that they were the pinnacle of order and justice. And yet, hidden behind their marble facades, they engineered crimes against humanity on a scale so vast that even now, 2,000 years later, we are still uncovering the evidence. Civilization, it turns out, doesn't always mean progress. Sometimes it means perfecting exploitation. The next time you hear someone say Rome was the foundation of the Western world, ask yourself, which Rome? The Rome of Cicero and Virgil, or the Rome of breeding manuals and mass infant graves? Because they were the same Rome. They existed side by side. And that's the uncomfortable truth. The same society that built aqueducts and wrote epics also calculated the price of a child before it was even born. The same empire that gave us law also perfected the science of human dehumanization. So what do we take from this? Not just horror, but warning. Because history has shown again and again how isolated societies justify cruelty when profit is at stake. Rome's breeding system wasn't an anomaly. It was a mirror. And that mirror still reflects us today. If this has unsettled you, it should, because it means Rome's legacy isn't just ruins and statues. It's a set of methods, economic, psychological, and medical, that continue to echo in modern systems of exploitation. Rome may have fallen, but its breeding logic lives on. And if this glimpse into the darkest corners of history has left you shaken, then remember, awareness is the first step. The stories Rome tried to erase: the voices of the enslaved, the cries of the mothers, the silence of the infants. They deserve to be heard. It's not as footnotes, but as the true foundation of what empire cost. Because the real measure of a civilization isn't its monuments, it's how it treats its most vulnerable. And by that measure, Rome was as advanced in cruelty as it was in engineering.